Hello, you hopeless romantics. Prepare to travel back in time to an era of jazz, secrets, and a love as dangerous as it was dazzling. The cold was a living thing in the Lower East Side tenement. It seeped through the warped window frames, crept under the door, and settled deep into the bones of anyone too poor or too slow to escape it. For Florence Ricky, it was a constant companion, a thin, ghostly hand resting on the back of her neck as she hunched over her father's threadbare coat, her needle flashing in the gloomy afternoon light. The world outside was a cacophony of life, the distant, mournful wail of a jazz trumpet from a speakeasy 2 streets over, the rumble of a Ford Model T backfiring, the shouts of vendors and the cries of children. But inside their small, 2-room apartment, the only sounds were the scratch of her needle against wool and the wet, rattling cough that echoed from the bedroom. Each cough was a chisel, chipping away at what little hope Florence had left. Her father, Marco, once a stonemason with hands strong enough to shape marble, was now a fragile husk, his strength stolen by the same dust that had once earned them their bread. His pride, however, remained stubbornly intact, a fact that made their current situation all the more unbearable. They were indebted, not to a bank or a friendly shopkeeper, but to a name that was never spoken above a whisper on these streets, a name that carried the weight of shattered kneecaps, sunken ships full of illicit liquor, and a silence more terrifying than any threat. Walter Moretti, the ghost. The debt had been Marcos's folly, a desperate loan taken a year ago to invest in a business venture that had collapsed as spectacularly as it had been promised. Florence had warned him, had pleaded with him not to get involved with such men, but his pride, his desperate need to provide for her after her mother's passing, had made him deaf. Now, the interest had compounded into an impossible sum, a phantom that haunted their every meager meal, every sleepless night. Florence finished her stitch, biting the thread with her teeth. She ran a hand over the rough patch. It would hold for a while longer. Everything in their life was temporary, a patch holding together a garment about to disintegrate. Florence. Her father's voice was a reedy whisper. She rose immediately, her joints aching from the cold and the sitting. "I'm here, Papa." She entered the small, shadowed room that served as his bedroom. He was propped up on a lumpy pillow, his face pale and gaunt, his great dark eyes swimming with a mixture of fever and fear. Is there any word?" he asked, the unspoken name hanging in the air between them. Florence forced a gentle smile, smoothing the thin blanket over his chest. "No word, Papa. That's good news. They've forgotten us." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Men like Walter Moretti did not forget. They were patient predators, content to let their prey exhaust themselves with fear before closing in for the kill. The weekly payments had stopped 2 months ago. They had nothing left to give. They were simply waiting for the inevitable collection. She brought him a cup of weak broth, the steam a fleeting warmth in the frigid air. As he sipped it, his hands trembling, the familiar rumble of the elevated train rattled the window pane. But then, another sound cut through the usual din of the city, a low, powerful purr, utterly alien to their street of pushcarts and tired workhorses, the sound of an expensive automobile engine idling directly below their window. Florence froze, the cup in her hand. Her father's eyes widened, the fear in them sharpening into stark terror. Neighbors' voices, usually a constant buzz, fell silent. Curtains twitched in the building across the narrow street. A presence had arrived, and the entire block held its breath. Then came the knock. It wasn't a polite rap or a hurried bang. It was 3 heavy, deliberate thuds against their flimsy wooden door. Each one landed like a blow to Florence's heart. This was it. The collection. "Stay here," she whispered to her father, her voice surprisingly steady, a strange calm settling over her, the calm of the condemned. She walked out of the bedroom, her back straight, her chin held high. She was a Risi. They did not cower. She smoothed her simple, faded dress and opened the door. The hallway was filled by two mountains of men in dark overcoats, their faces grim and impassive. But her eyes were drawn to the figure standing between them, slightly back, cloaked in the shadows of the poorly lit corridor. He stepped forward, and the weak gaslight caught the sharp lines of a face that was both brutally handsome and chillingly severe. He was younger than the legend suggested, perhaps not yet 30, but he carried an ancient stillness. His dark hair was impeccably styled, his pinstripe suit tailored with a precision that bespoke immense wealth. It fit his broad shoulders perfectly, a stark, clean silhouette against the grimy, peeling paint of the hallway. He removed his grey fedora, revealing eyes the color of cold, wet slate. They took in her worn dress, her bare feet on the cold floorboards, the visible poverty of her home, with an unnerving lack of expression. There was no pity, no contempt. There was nothing. "Walter Moretti, Miss Rixey," he said. His voice was not loud, but it filled the small space entirely. It was a low baritone, smooth as whiskey, but with an edge of pure steel, completely devoid of warmth. Florence simply nodded, her throat too tight for words. He gestured with his chin, and his two guards remained in the hall, turning to face outward like stone sentinels. Walter Moretti stepped across her threshold alone, bringing with him the scent of expensive cologne, tobacco, and the winter air. He moved with a quiet, predatory grace, his presence seeming to suck all the warmth and air from the room. He didn't look at her. His gaze swept over the sparse furniture, the mended coat on the chair, the single, sputtering gas lamp. It was a look of assessment, as if he were cataloguing an inventory. "Your father," he stated, not asked. "He is unwell," Florence said, finding her voice. It came out stronger than she expected. "I am aware," Moretti replied, his gaze finally settling on her. It was an unnerving experience, like being pinned by a hawk. He saw everything and revealed nothing. "His debt remains." "We have nothing," she said, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "You can take the furniture. It's not worth much, but it's all we have." A flicker of something, was it amusement, or just impatience, crossed his face, gone as quickly as it came. "I am not a furniture mover, Miss Rixey. Your father's material possessions are of no interest to me." From the bedroom, a weak, pleading voice called out, "Mr. Moretti, please, give me more time. I will pay you back, every cent." Walter Moretti ignored him completely, his focus entirely on Florence. He took another step closer, forcing her to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. He was tall, imposing, a creature of power and shadow, who had no place in this world of desperation and decay. "Time has run out," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "But I am a reasonable man. I have come with an alternative proposal to settle Marco Rixey's account in full." Florence's heart hammered against her ribs. What could he possibly want? There was nothing left. Was he here to make an example of them, to drag her father from his sickbed into the street? "The money is gone," she insisted, a desperate edge creeping into her tone. "I know," he said calmly. "That is why. I am not here for the money." He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the fear build. His slate-grey eyes bored into hers, and in their depths she saw the cold, hard certainty of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. He was a king in his own dark kingdom, and she was a subject who had been summoned to court. "The debt," he said finally, his voice a silken blade, "will be erased. Your father will be provided for. A doctor will see him. He will live out his days in comfort and safety." Florence stared, bewildered. This wasn't happening. It was a fever dream. Men like him didn't offer charity. Every gift came with a price tag, written in blood or tears. What What is the price?" she breathed. Walter Moretti's expression did not change, but she felt the finality of his words, like a cage door slamming shut around her. He looked at her, not as a person, but as a possession, an asset to be acquired. "You, Florence," he said, the name a strange cold thing on his tongue. "You are the price." She could only stare, uncomprehending. "Your father's debt is an anchor, pulling him into the grave. I am offering to cut the rope," he continued, his logic as sharp and merciless as a razor. "In return for this generosity, you will become my wife." The word hit her with the force of a physical blow. Wife. It was absurd. It was monstrous. A man like him, a creature of the night, and her, a girl from the slums whose only assets were her pride and her worn-out sewing needle. A hysterical laugh almost bubbled up in her throat, but the look in his eyes killed it instantly. This was not a joke. This was not a negotiation. It was a decree. You cannot be serious," she stammered. "I am never anything but serious," he replied, his tone flat. "This is the arrangement. Your compliance ensures your father's life. Your refusal ensures his debt is collected by other, less pleasant means. The choice is yours, of course, but I do not think it is a difficult one." He saw the war in her eyes, the fierce, defiant pride fighting against the raw, desperate love for her father. He saw the moment her spirit broke, the moment the fight drained out of her, replaced by a cold, hollow resignation. He had won before the battle had even begun. He reached into his coat and produced a small, elegant card. "A car will be here tomorrow at dawn. Be ready. You will bring nothing." He placed the card on the small table beside the door and turned to leave. He had not raised his voice. He had not issued a single threat. He had simply stated the terms of a contract of shadows sealed not with ink, but with her soul. At the door, he paused and looked back at her, a final, chilling instruction. "And Florence," he said, his voice a soft, dangerous whisper that would haunt her dreams, "do not for a second think you can run. This city is mine. There is nowhere for you to go." Then he was gone. The door clicked shut, leaving Florence alone in the sudden, deafening silence. The world she knew had just ended. She was no longer Florence Ricky, a stonemason's daughter. She was a debt, paid in full. She was the property of Walter Moretti. Dawn in the Lower East Side was not a gentle awakening. It was a slow, reluctant surrender of the night, the sky turning the color of a dirty pearl over the jagged rooftops. Florence had not slept. She sat on the edge of her lumpy cart, fully dressed in her one good wool skirt and a mended blouse, listening to the city stir to life. It was a symphony she had known since birth, the rattle of the milkman's cart, the distant clang of a trolley, the first shouts from the bakery below, and today it sounded like a funeral dirge. A final, choked conversation with her father was a blur of tears and promises. He clutched her hand, his own as frail as a bird's wing, his eyes alight with a feverish guilt. "Figlia mia," he'd whispered, the Italian endearment a knife in her heart. "My daughter, forgive me." "There is nothing to forgive, Papa," she had lied, her voice a hollow shell. "You will be well. That is all that matters." She could not bring herself to tell him the full truth of the bargain. He knew she was leaving to settle the debt, but the word wife was a horror she spared him. Punctually, as the first true rays of sun struck the grimy brick of the opposite building, the low purr of the expensive engine returned. She looked out the window one last time. The long, black Pierce Arrow was a hearse waiting at her curb. Children stopped their games to stare. Women peered from their windows, their expressions a mixture of awe and pity. In one swift, silent transaction, Florence Ricky had become a neighborhood spectacle, a cautionary tale whispered over laundry lines. She kissed her father's forehead, a final desperate act of love, and walked out without looking back. To look back would be to shatter into 1,000 pieces. One of the hulking guards from the previous night opened the car door for her. The interior was a cavern of plush leather and polished wood, smelling faintly of cedar. It was more luxurious than any room she had ever been in. As the door clicked shut, it sealed her off from her world, the familiar sounds of her street muffled into a distant hum. She was an artifact being placed in a display case. The journey uptown was a journey between worlds. The crowded, chaotic streets of her childhood, teeming with life and struggle, gave way to the wide, orderly boulevards of Manhattan's elite. The buildings grew taller, grander, their stone facades clean and imposing. Here the horses were for sport, the cars were gleaming chariots, and the people moved with an unhurried grace that spoke of lives untouched by desperation. The car finally glided to a stop before a limestone mansion on Fifth Avenue that was less a house and more a fortress of wealth. Gargoyles sneered from its cornices, and ornate ironwork guarded the towering front doors. This was not a home. It was a statement of power, designed to intimidate and awe. The door was opened by a stern-faced butler who looked her over with a single dismissive glance. He led her into a foyer so vast it could have swallowed her entire tenement building. The floor was a checkerboard of black and white marble, polished to a mirror shine. A colossal crystal chandelier hung from a ceiling 2 stories high, its prisms scattering cold, lifeless light. The air was still and silent, the only sound the click of her worn shoes against the marble. It was the oppressive silence of a tomb. A woman, in a severe black dress, her hair pulled into a tight, unforgiving bun, descended the grand staircase. Her face was a mask of professional neutrality. "Miss Ricky," she said, her voice crisp and devoid of welcome. "I am Mrs. Albright, the housekeeper. Mr. Moretti is expecting you. Follow me." Florence followed her up the sweeping staircase, her hand hovering over the polished mahogany banister, but not daring to touch it. They passed portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow her with disapproval. They walked down a long, carpeted hallway, where the silence was so profound she could hear the frantic beat of her own heart. Mrs. Albright stopped before a set of double doors and knocked once. A familiar, low baritone voice called, "Enter." The room was a library, its walls lined from floor to ceiling with leather-bound books that looked as if they had never been read. A fire crackled in a massive stone fireplace, but it gave off no warmth, and behind a desk the size of a small boat sat Walter Moretti. He was not in a suit, but a dark silk dressing gown, a cup of coffee at his elbow. He was reading a ledger, and he did not look up for a full minute after they entered, leaving Florence to stand in the center of the room like a petitioner before a king. The deliberate ignorance was a calculated display of power. She was on his time, in his world. She was nothing. Finally, he closed the ledger, the soft thud echoing in the stillness. He lifted his slate-gray eyes and truly looked at her. "Mrs. Albright, you may leave us." The housekeeper vanished as silently as she had appeared, closing the doors behind her. Now they were alone. "Welcome to your new home, Florence," he said, the word home a bitter irony. He rose and walked around the desk, his movements fluid and controlled. He circled her as a wolf might circle a lamb, his gaze assessing. "I trust your journey was acceptable." "It was," she said, her voice tight. "Good." He stopped in front of her. "Let us be clear on the terms of our arrangements, so there are no misunderstandings." He gestured to a velvet armchair near the fire. "Sit." It was an order. Florence remained standing. A flicker of annoyance crossed his features, the first crack in his icy composure. "As you wish," he said coolly. "The rules are simple. This house is yours to enjoy. You will want for nothing. Food, comfort, security all are provided. A seamstress will be here this afternoon. Your current wardrobe is not suitable." He waved a dismissive hand at her simple dress, the gesture a stinging insult. "In public," he continued, his voice hardening slightly. "You are Mrs. Walter Moretti. You will be respectful, you will be demure, and you will be silent unless spoken to. You are a symbol of my status, a beautiful, quiet accessory. Your sole function is to be seen at my side when I require it." He paused, letting the words sink in. "In exchange, your father's medical care is arranged. He is being moved to a private sanitarium upstate today. The best doctors, the cleanest air. He will be comfortable." This was the gilded hook in the trap, the one thing that's kept her from screaming. "You are not to leave this house without my express permission and one of my men as an escort," he went on. "Your correspondence will be monitored. You will have no contact with your old life. That life is over. Do you understand?" Each rule was another bar on her cage. The sheer cold-blooded totality of his control was suffocating. He was not just imprisoning her body, he was attempting to systematically erase her very identity. And something inside Florence, the stubborn, resilient core that had survived poverty and grief, refused to be extinguished. "And what do you get from this arrangement?" she asked, her voice quiet but laced with defiance, beyond a silent accessory. Walter seemed taken aback by the direct question. He studied her for a moment, a new light in his eyes. It wasn't anger, it was curiosity. "I get certainty," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense murmur. "In my world, loyalties are bought and alliances are temporary. Betrayal is the currency we trade in. But this is a transaction. It is clean. You exist to serve a purpose, and your father's life is the collateral that ensures you will perform that purpose flawlessly. There is no messy emotion. There is no possibility of betrayal. There is only the contract." The raw cynicism of his worldview was staggering. He saw the world as a ledger of debts and assets, and she was merely the latest entry. The insult was so profound it burned away her fear, leaving only a cold, hard anger. "I see," she said, lifting her chin. "You have purchased my presence, Mr. Moretti. You have not purchased my soul." The silence that followed was electric. His eyes narrowed, the slate gray darkening to charcoal. He took a step closer, his height and presence dominating her completely. She expected him to lash out, to punish her for her insolence. Instead, he did something far more unsettling. A slow, cold smile touched his lips, a smile that held no humor, only a chilling sense of victory. "Your soul," he whispered, his voice a silken threat, "is of no interest to me, but your compliance is, and I will have it." He turned and walked back to his desk, dismissing her as if the conversation was over. "Mrs. Albright will show you to your rooms. The seamstress arrives at 2. Florence stood her ground for another second, her heart hammering. She'd challenged him, a small, desperate act of rebellion, and had seen a glimpse of the dangerous man beneath the controlled facade. He was not just cruel. He was a man who relished control, who saw the world as his personal chessboard. She turned and left the library, her steps silent on the thick Persian rug. Mrs. Albright was waiting in the hall, her face impassive. She led Florence up another flight of stairs to a wing of the house that was clearly the master suite. The bedroom was enormous, dominated by a heavy 4-poster bed. Adjoining it was a dressing room lined with empty mahogany wardrobes and a bathroom of gleaming marble and gold fixtures. It was a palace, and it was a prison. Florence walked to the tall windows and looked down at the manicured garden below, a perfect, sterile square of green, enclosed by a high stone wall. She had tested the bars of her gilded cage and found them to be made of unyielding steel, but the spark of defiance he had ignited in her did not die. It settled deep within her, a small, hot coal. He may have owned her life, but she would be damned if she let him own her. This was not a marriage. It was a war, and it had just begun. The 2 weeks that followed were a disorienting dream of silk and solitude. Florence's days were measured not by hours, but by fittings. Seamstresses, milliners, and cobblers paraded through the silent mansion, their arms laden with fabrics and leathers that cost more than her father had earned in a year. She was a doll, being dressed for a play she hadn't auditioned for, her body a mannequin upon which Walter Moretti's wealth was draped. She was given afternoon dresses of soft crepe de chine, walking suits of fine wool, and evening gowns that shimmered with a king's ransom in beads and sequins. Her worn-out shoes were replaced by rows of elegant T-straps and satin pumps. She learned the unfamiliar weight of pearls against her throat and the cold kiss of diamonds on her earlobes. But with every new garment, another layer of her old self was stripped away, buried under a mountain of luxury. Walter remained a distant, formidable presence. He was a creature of the night, leaving before she awoke and returning long after the sun had set. They shared the occasional, silent dinner at opposite ends of a baronial dining table, the cavernous space between them charged with a tension she could not name. He watched her, his slate-gray eyes missing nothing, the way she held her silver fork, the straightness of her spine, the defiant tilt of her chin. It was not the gaze of a husband, but of a warden inspecting his most valuable prisoner. Then, one evening, he entered her suite of rooms without knocking. She was reading by the window, a book of poetry she'd found in the library, and the sudden intrusion made her heart leap into her throat. He was dressed for the evening in a flawless black tuxedo, the stark white of his shirt making his presence seem even darker, more absolute. "You will be accompanying me tonight," he said, his voice flat. He held out a long velvet box. "Wear this." She opened it. Nestled on a bed of white satin lay a necklace of emeralds, each stone the color of a deep, mossy forest, surrounded by a halo of glittering diamonds. It was breathtakingly beautiful, and it felt as heavy as a set of chains. "There is an event," he continued, his tone leaving no room for questions. "A gathering. You will be formally introduced as my wife." An hour later, transformed by a shimmering, silver-beaded dress that fell in a straight line to her knees and ended in a fringe of silk, Florence felt like a complete imposter. Her dark hair, once tied back in a simple braid, had been expertly bobbed and styled into sleek waves that framed her face. The emeralds were cold against her skin. When she looked in the mirror, a stranger stared back, a fashionable, bejeweled flapper, her eyes wide with the trapped look of a startled doe. Walter was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. As she descended, his gaze swept over her, a slow, meticulous inventory. For the first time, she saw something other than cold assessment in his eyes. It was a flicker of dark, possessive approval. He approved of his creation. "Acceptable," was all he said, but the word hung in the air with the weight of a royal decree. He offered her his arm, his touch firm and impersonal through the fabric of his coat. The pierced arrow carried them through the rain-slicked streets to a sprawling estate on the north shore of Long Island. The mansion was ablaze with light, music spilling from its open doors, a wild, frenetic jazz that sounded more like a battle cry than a celebration. This was no polite society ball. It was a gathering of the underworld's royalty. Inside, the air was thick with cigar smoke, expensive perfume, and the cloying scent of bootleg gin. A sea of masked faces turned toward them as they entered. The music faltered for a beat, and a wave of whispers followed their progress across the floor. This was his court, and he was the king, presenting his new queen. Walter navigated the throng with an effortless authority, his hand a proprietary weight on the small of her Florence's back. Men with hard eyes and hidden guns nodded at him in deference. Women, dripping with jewels and malice, watched Florence from behind their feathered masks, their gazes sharp and speculative. "Stay by my side," Walter murmured, his voice a low command near her ear. "Smile, and do not speak to anyone unless I permit it." For the next hour, she was a silent ornament. She stood beside him as he conducted quiet, intense conversations, with men whose names she recognized from hushed stories on the street: gangsters, bootleggers, corrupt city officials. She learned to hold her champagne coupe without letting her hand tremble, to smile when a politician leered at her, to be entirely present and completely invisible at the same time. It was during a moment when Walter was cornered by a portly senator that another man materialized at her side. He was tall and lean, wearing a tuxedo with a casual elegance that seemed to defy the tension in the room. His mask was a simple black domino, but it did little to hide the charismatic glint in his eyes or the confident curve of his lips. "The ghost has outdone himself," the man said, his voice a smooth, charming baritone like warm honey. "He keeps you hidden away, and now we all see why. A treasure like you is best kept under lock and key." Florence stiffened. "I'm sorry, have we been introduced?" He gave a slight, mocking bow. "Arthur Gallo, a business associate of your husband, and you are the mysterious Mrs. Moretti, the talk of the city." His eyes, a warm, intelligent brown, crinkled at the corners. He possessed a charm that was as potent as it was unsettling. It was a practiced, predatory charm, entirely different from Walter's cold brutality. "There is nothing mysterious about me," Florence replied, her tone cooler than she intended. I disagree," Arthur purred, stepping a fraction closer. "A rose blooming in the ghost's frozen garden. That is the greatest mystery of all. Tell me, does he ever let you see the sun?" Before she could answer, a cold presence enveloped them. Walter had returned, his face an unreadable mask, but the temperature around them had dropped by 20 degrees. His hand was once again on her back, this time a warning, his fingers pressing into her spine. "Gallo," Walter said, his voice dangerously soft. "I see you are admiring my wife, merely welcoming her to our little family." "Walter," Arthur replied, his smile never wavering. The air between the two men crackled with a palpable, old hatred. "She is even more lovely than the rumors suggested. Stay away from her," Walter said. It was not a request. It was an unbreakable command. Arthur simply chuckled, a low, confident sound. "As you wish, for now." He gave Florence a lingering look, then bowed again and melted back into the crowd. Walter's grip tightened, and he steered her towards a quieter alcove. "I told you not to speak to anyone." "He spoke to me," she shot back in a fierce whisper. "What was I to do? Slap him?" Walter's jaw clenched, a muscle pulsing in his cheek. His anger was a physical thing, a cold fire radiating from him. Before he could retort, they were interrupted by a woman with flame-red hair and a laugh like shattering glass. She was older, her face a carefully painted map of a life lived in excess. "Walter, darling," she exclaimed, tapping his arm with a fan. She looked Florence up and down with the shrewd eye of a pawnbroker. "Well, well, so this is the new one. You certainly have a type, don't you? All dark hair and defiance." She leaned in conspiratorially towards Florence, her breath smelling of gin and secrets. "A word of advice, honey. Learn your place. He doesn't take kindly to surprises." She winked, then gestured vaguely with her fan. "Just ask Beatrice." The name hung in the air. Beatrice. Florence felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "Beatrice?" The woman's smile became pitying. "Ah, you poor thing. He didn't tell you." She glanced over her shoulder to ensure Walter was distracted again. "His first fiancée. Looked a lot like you, actually. A real society beauty. Broke his heart clean in two. Ran off with one of his rivals, a man from the Gallo family. Can you imagine the nerve?" Florence's blood ran cold. "Arthur Gallo." She thought she could play them both, the woman whispered, her voice dropping. She chose wrong. They found her a month later. The official story was a boating accident. "But darling," she tapped Florence's arm again, her painted nails like tiny claws. "In our world, there are no accidents." The woman drifted away, leaving Florence reeling, the jazz music suddenly sounding harsh and discordant. She looked across the room at her husband. He was standing alone, watching her, his face a mask of stone. But now, she saw something else behind the mask. She saw the ghost the gossiping woman had spoken of. His cruelty, his possessiveness, his obsession with control, and his chilling talk of betrayal. It all snapped into a horrifying focus. He wasn't just a monster. He was a man who had been hollowed out by a past wound, a wound so deep that he had walled off his heart with ice and stone. This elaborate, controlling marriage wasn't just a transaction. It was a desperate, pathological attempt to prevent history from repeating itself. And she, with her dark hair and defiance, was the living, breathing ghost of the woman who had destroyed him. The ride home was conducted in absolute, suffocating silence. Florence sat on her side of the vast leather seat, the emeralds feeling like a hangman's noose around her neck. She stole a glance at Walter's profile, silhouetted against the passing streetlights. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw set like granite, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. He was not just her captor. He was a man haunted by a devastating betrayal, and in her he saw not a wife, but the constant, terrifying echo of the woman who had broken him. The gilded cage had suddenly become much darker and much more dangerous. The knowledge of Beatrice changed everything. The silence in the mansion was no longer empty. It was heavy with the ghost of a woman Florence had never met. Every portrait seemed to watch her with Beatrice's eyes. Every shadow in the long hallways seemed to hold her shape. Florence felt as though she were living in a mausoleum built for one man's broken heart, and she was the unwilling effigy placed upon the tomb. Walter's behavior shifted from cold distance to a tense, suffocating vigilance. He was home more often, appearing silently in doorways. His eyes narrowed as she read in the library or arranged flowers in the parlor. He was watching her, but he wasn't seeing her. He was searching for the telltale signs of a betrayal that had happened years ago, superimposing the face of a dead woman over hers. The quiet dinners became unbearable. Interrogations conducted without words. His stare asked the questions. Who are you thinking of? What are you plotting? Are you like her? Florence felt her spirit beginning to fray. The beautiful clothes were costumes. The lavish meals were tasteless. The gilded cage was shrinking by the day. She was a prisoner not only of Walter's contract, but of his memory. Then, one rainy Tuesday, a delivery arrived. Not the usual boxes from Bergdorf's or Tiffany's, but a simple, long box from a florist. Inside, nestled in a bed of tissue paper, was a single perfect white rose. It was an impossibly beautiful, innocent thing in the oppressive atmosphere of the house. But tucked into its leaves was a small, folded card. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was an elegant, masculine script, a single bloom for the one wilting in the ghost's garden. Know that you have friends outside the walls. Arthur Gallo. Ice flooded her veins. It was a gesture of sympathy on the surface, but she knew it was a move in a dangerous game, a pebble tossed to test the defenses of Walter's fortress. Her first instinct was to burn it, to destroy any evidence of this intrusion, but she hesitated. The words, "friends outside the walls," resonated with the deepest, most desperate part of her soul. For a fleeting moment, the note felt less like a threat and more like a lifeline. Before she could decide, the library doors opened. Walter stood there, his gaze immediately locking onto the box in her hands, then to the card. His face, usually a mask of control, went utterly blank, a stillness more terrifying than any rage. "What is that?" he asked, his voice deceptively soft. "It's nothing. A mistake," she said, her heart pounding, trying to slide the card under the box. He moved with a speed that was startling. In 2 long strides he was in front of her, his hand closing over hers, prying the card from her grasp. He read the short message, his expression hardening into something brutal. The air crackled, charged with a sudden, violent energy. He said, the letter a hiss of contempt. Arthur, Walter, I don't know how he... Silence. The word was a whip crack. He crumpled the note in his fist, his knuckles white. So it begins. Again. He wasn't looking at her anymore. His eyes were dark with the ghosts of the past. Did he send you flowers? Did he whisper pretty words about freedom? Did he promise you a life of sunshine, away from my shadows? His voice was a low, venomous snarl. He was talking to her, but the questions were for Beatrice. I have never spoken to the man beyond that one night, Florence cried, her voice rising with a mixture of fear and outrage. I would never. Don't lie to me. He took a step closer, backing her against the cold marble of the fireplace. He was a pillar of fury, his control shattered, revealing the raw, wounded man beneath. He preys on weakness. He smells it, like a shark smells blood. He saw it in you that night, the same defiance, the same restless spirit, the same poison. Every word was an accusation, an echo of a previous fight, a previous betrayal. She was being tried and convicted for another woman's crimes. The injustice of it was a fire in her blood. The only poison here is your own suspicion, she retorted, her fear momentarily eclipsed by her anger. You see her everywhere, don't you? You look at me and you see a ghost. You think I am so weak, so faithless, that I would risk my father's life for a few pretty words from a stranger. Faith is a luxury I cannot afford, he snarled, his face inches from hers. He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. She spoke of love, she swore her loyalty, and all the while she was meeting him in secret, selling my plans, laughing at me with the rest of the gallow filth. She made me a fool. His eyes were burning with a pain so raw it was shocking to behold. In that moment, he was not the all-powerful Walter Moretti. He was a man flayed open, his oldest wound exposed and bleeding, but his pain made him cruel, not sympathetic. He saw her defiance not as strength, but as proof of her duplicity. I am not her, Florence whispered, her voice breaking. His grip tightened, his thumb pressing into the delicate skin of her wrist. Prove it. The words hung between them, an impossible demand. How could she prove a negative? How could she fight a ghost? She saw in his eyes that there was no way. Any defense was a lie. Any denial was an admission of guilt. He had already decided who she was. He released her as abruptly as he had grabbed her, turning his back on her as if he couldn't bear the sight of her. Get out of my sight, he growled, his voice thick with disgust. Go to your room. You are not to leave it. Florence fled, her heart a wild, panicked bird beating against her ribs. She didn't stop until she was in her palatial bedroom, the door locked behind her. She sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around herself, the imprint of his fingers already purpling on her skin. It was over. The hope she had secretly nurtured, that he might one day see her for who she was, that this arrangement might become something bearable, was gone. She was trapped in a cycle of his past trauma, a drama in which she had been cast in the role of the traitor. He would never trust her. He would never see her. She would spend the rest of her life as a prisoner, watched by a man who both desired and despised her for the ghosts she represented. She couldn't live like this. She wouldn't. A desperate, wild plan began to form in her mind. It was madness. He had told her himself the city was his. There was nowhere to go. But the alternative, slowly suffocating under the weight of his paranoia until her spirit was completely crushed, was a fate worse than death. She had no money, no allies. Arthur Gallo's note was a temptation, but she knew he was a snake, offering a different kind of poison. She had to do this alone. For the next 2 days, she was a model prisoner. She stayed in her room, had her meals brought on a tray, and spoke to no one. But all the while, she was watching, listening, remembering the layout of the mansion. She observed the guards' routines from her window, the timing of the deliveries, the servants' movements. Her chance came on the 3rd night. There was a hidden door in the back of her cavernous wardrobe, a relic from a previous owner, which led to a narrow servant's corridor. From there, she knew a small, winding staircase led down to the laundry room in the basement. And in the laundry room, there was a chute for coal delivery, a small, filthy opening that led to the alleyway behind the mansion. It was a sliver of a chance, a dirty, dangerous path to freedom. Dressed in the simplest, darkest dress she now owned, her jewels left behind on the vanity like discarded shackles, she stood before the wardrobe. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror, an exhilarating hope. He had taken everything from her, her home, her name, her freedom, but he had not taken her will to survive. She would rather face the wolves on the street than remain a ghost in this beautiful, haunted prison. Taking a deep breath, she opened the wardrobe and slipped into the darkness behind the silken sequins. Do you believe love can conquer time and memory? Tell us in the comments. The alley air hit Florence like a physical blow. It was a fetid cocktail of wet garbage, coal smoke, and desperation, the familiar perfume of her former life. She scrambled from the coal chute, her fine dress instantly smeared with grime, her hands raw. For a moment, she was paralyzed by the sheer, terrifying reality of her freedom. The sounds of the city were sharp and immediate, no longer muffled by stone walls and thick glass. A nearby jazz clarinet wailed a lament, a cat screeched, and the distant roar of the elevated train was the sound of a beast stirring in its sleep. She was a tiny, insignificant creature in the belly of that beast. Clutching the thin fabric of her dress, she ran. She had no destination, only a direction, away from the sterile perfection of Fifth Avenue and into the chaotic, anonymous labyrinth of the slums. Every passing shadow was one of Walter's men. Every pair of headlights was his pierced sorrow, coming to drag her back. Her name, her face, they were a liability now. She was the property of Walter Moretti, and he did not suffer his property to be stolen. In the silent mansion, Walter stood in her empty bedroom. The air was still faintly scented with her perfume, a ghostly presence that mocked him. On the vanity, the emerald necklace lay coiled like a sleeping serpent, its cold fire a testament to her rejection. He saw the open wardrobe, the faint scuff marks on the floor, the disturbed dust behind the hanging gowns. He traced the path she had taken with a cold, analytical eye. It was clever, it was desperate, it was a declaration of war. A fury, glacial and absolute, rose in him. It was the familiar rage of being defied, of his perfect control being shattered. He descended the stairs, his steps silent and deadly. His men, stationed in the foyer, straightened instinctively at the look on his face. "She's gone," he stated, his voice a low, lethal hum. "Find her. Lock this island down. Every ferry, every bridge, every train station. Use every man we have. I want eyes on every corner, from here to the Battery. Nobody sleeps until she is found." The men scrambled to obey, the house buzzing with the sudden, quiet efficiency of a disturbed hornet's nest. But as Walter stood alone in the marble foyer, the cold fury began to thaw at the edges, replaced by an unfamiliar and unwelcome sensation, a raw, gnawing dread. When Beatrice had left, his rage had been hot and clean, fueled by the humiliation of her betrayal. This was different. Florence hadn't run to another man. She had run from him, from the cage he had built. He had seen the terror in her eyes during their last confrontation, but he had also seen the fierce, unbroken spirit he had secretly come to admire. The thought of that spirit being crushed by the brutal reality of the streets, or worse, falling into the hands of a man like Gallo, was a physical pain, a tightening in his chest so profound it stole his breath. He wasn't just angry that a possession had escaped, he was terrified of what the world would do to her. For 2 days Florence was a ghost. She haunted the grim alleyways of her old neighborhood, moving only at night. She sold a small, plain silver locket she'd managed to hide in her pocket, a gift from her mother for a few dollars. Enough for stale bread and a bed in a flophouse where the snores of exhausted men were a symphony of despair. The freedom she had craved was a bitter illusion. Out here, she was not free. She was prey. The world that had once been her home now looked at her with hungry eyes. Men sized her up with leering glances. She saw Walter's men too. They were discreet, almost invisible, their dark coats and fedoras blending into the shadows, their questioning of shopkeepers quiet and methodical. But on the second night, she saw different men. These men were not quiet. They moved in a pack, their suits flashy, their voices loud. They weren't searching, they were hunting. They showed her likeness, sketched from a newspaper society page to a street vendor, their questions laced with a crude familiarity. They were Arthur Gallows' men. A new, colder fear gripped her. She had escaped Walter's cage, only to find herself in a much larger, more dangerous hunting ground, caught between two predators. Walter's protection, which had felt like a prison, now seemed like the only shield she'd ever had against the true monsters of this city. She was cornered. She found refuge from a sudden downpour in the derelict shell of a burned-out tenement building, a place where children once played, and now only rats skittered in the darkness. Huddled in a crumbling doorway, shivering from the cold and the rain, she finally let the tears come. They were hot tears of exhaustion, fear, and utter hopelessness. She had gambled everything on a freedom that did not exist, and she had lost. A footstep crunched on the debris behind her. She whirled around, her heart stopping. It wasn't one of Gallows' thugs. A single, tall figure stood silhouetted against the weak light of the alley, the rain running off the brim of his fedora. He was utterly still, a phantom carved from the night. Walter. He had found her. There were no guards, no hulking enforcers, just him. He stepped forward into the faint light, and she saw his face. His expression was not triumphant. It was a mask of grim, weary relief, his eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't decipher. "Did you really think you could hide from me?" he asked, his voice rough, stripped of its usual icy control. Florence scrambled to her feet, backing away until her shoulders hit the cold, wet brick. "Stay away from me. There is nowhere for you to go, Florence," he said, taking another slow step. "Gallows' men are 2 blocks from here. They are not as patient as I am. Did you run to him? Was that your plan?" The old accusation was there, but it lacked its venom. It sounded like a question born of fear, not certainty. "I ran from you," she cried, the words tearing from her throat, raw and painful. "I ran from this prison you've built. I ran from the ghost of a dead woman you see every time you look at me." Her words struck him like a physical blow. He stopped, the rain dripping from his hat, his face a battleground of conflicting emotions. "I was not going to live my life as her shadow," she sobbed, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a profound weariness. Punished for her sins, hated for her betrayal. "I am not Beatrice." The name, spoken aloud in this desolate place, broke something in him. The iron mask of Walter Moretti, the ghost, the Capo, finally cracked. He raked a hand through his wet hair, his shoulders slumping with a weight she had never seen him carry. "I know you're not," he said, his voice so low it was almost lost in the sound of the rain. He looked up at her, and his eyes were raw, stripped of all their defenses. For the first time she saw not the monster, but the man he had once been. She, Beatrice. "She was my everything," he began, the confession ragged, forced from a place he had kept locked away for years. "I was young. I thought I was untouchable. I gave her my trust. It was the last time I ever gave it to anyone. She smiled at me, she planned our future, and all the while she was in Gallows' bed. Not Arthur's, his uncle's. She sold my secrets. She conspired to have me killed. He let out a hollow, bitter laugh. They failed. I did not. The night I found out. The night I dealt with them. A part of me died with them. I buried my heart that day, Florence. I walled it up and swore no one would ever get close enough to touch it again. He took a step closer, his gaze locked on hers, pleading and intense. This arrangement with you, it was supposed to be simple. A contract. No emotion, no trust required. But you, he shook his head, struggling for words. You were not simple. You fought me. You challenged me. You looked at me not with fear, but with fire. I saw it, and it terrified me. He was in front of her now, close enough to touch. He gently brushed a stray, rain-soaked strand of hair from her cheek, his touch surprisingly hesitant. When I found out Beatrice was gone, I felt nothing but cold rage. It was a problem to be solved, he confessed, his voice dropping to a raw whisper. But these last 2 days, knowing you were out here, alone, hunted, when I walked into your room and you were gone, it was not rage I felt, Florence. It was silence, like the entire world had stopped breathing. He looked down at her, his guard completely gone, leaving only a devastating vulnerability. I am not afraid of you betraying me. I am afraid of a world without you in it, and I do not know what to do with that feeling. Florence stared up at him, breathless. The rain continued to fall around them, washing the grime from the city, but in their small, sheltered space, time had stopped. He had hunted her down not to reclaim a possession, but because the thought of losing her was more than he could bear. The cruel, untouchable Capo had just confessed that she, Florence Rissi from the slums, had become his one weakness, and his one hope. The confession hung in the rain-soaked air, a fragile truce in the ruins of the burned-out tenement. Walter's vulnerability was more disarming than any show of force. For the first time, Florence saw him not as a captor, but as a man shackled to his own past, and she was the key he never knew he needed. The space between them, once a chasm of fear and mistrust, was now filled with a startling, terrifying intimacy. He took off his heavy overcoat and draped it over her shivering shoulder. It smelled of him, of rain, expensive wool, and something uniquely masculine and protective. He gently took her arm, his touch no longer a demand, but a plea. "Come home, Florence," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Let me protect you. Home." The word was still a paradox, but it no longer sounded like a prison sentence. She gave a slight, exhausted nod. The fight was over, for now. He led her out of the derelict building and into the waiting Pierce Arrow, which had materialized at the end of the alley, like a silent, black beast. The interior was warm and dry. As the car pulled away from the curb, leaving the squalor of the slums behind, Florence saw 2 of Gallo's men emerge from a nearby doorway, their faces contorted in frustration as they watched their prize slip away. They had been closer than she'd realized. A cold shudder ran down her spine. The journey back to the mansion was silent, but it was a different kind of silence. It was not the oppressive, angry quiet of their previous rides. It was heavy with unspoken words, with the raw emotion of his confession. When they arrived, he led her not to her own suite, but to his. He guided her into the vast marble bathroom and turned on the hot water in the clawfoot tub. "You're freezing," he said, his tone gentle, almost hesitant. He left a stack of soft towels and one of his own silk dressing gowns on a chair. "I'll have Mrs. Albright bring you some food." As she sank into the steaming water, the grime and cold of the streets melting away, Florence felt the last of her defenses dissolve. He had hunted her, yes, but he had found her and offered her sanctuary, not punishment. He had shown her the wounded heart beneath the armor of the beast. Later, wrapped in the impossibly soft silk of his robe, she found him standing by the fire in his library, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. The tension had returned to his shoulders, his face once again a carefully controlled mask. "Walter," she began softly. Before he could respond, the heavy library doors burst open. It was Vincent, his most trusted and senior man, his face pale, his breathing ragged. "Boss," he panted, "it's Gallo. He has a message." Vincent's eyes flickered to Florence, a clear warning in them. Walter's face hardened, the brief moment of vulnerability vanishing as if it had never been. "What is it?" Vincent hesitated. "It's about her father." Florence's blood turned to ice. She took an involuntary step forward. "My father? What about my father?" Walter held up a hand, silencing her, his gaze locked on his man. "Speak." Gallo's men. "They went to the sanitarium upstate," Vincent said, the words coming out in a rush. "They took him. They have Marco Ricci." The room tilted. Florence swayed, grabbing the back of a chair for support. A roaring filled her ears. Her father, the one person whose safety had been the entire foundation of this damnable bargain. Walter was a statue of pure cold fury. "Where?" he bit out. "Pier 12. The old cannery warehouse," Vincent replied. "Gallo wants a meeting. Midnight. He says to come alone. The price for the old man's life is your territory south of Canal Street. Everything. The speakeasies, the docks, the whole operation." It was an impossible demand. It was half his empire. It was an act of war designed to cripple him, to humiliate him. In their world, a capo who surrendered territory was a dead man walking. It was a sign of weakness that every other shark in the water would pounce upon. Walter's mind raced. It was a trap, a blatant, obvious trap. Gallo wouldn't just take the territory. He would take Walter's life as well, cementing his own rise to power. And at the center of it all was Florence. Her father was the bait, but she was the reason. Gallo had seen her, identified her as Walter's one exploitable weakness, and had struck with brutal precision. Florence looked at Walter, her eyes wide with terror and a desperate silent plea. "Walter, please, you have to save him." He looked from her terrified face to Vincent's grim one. He saw the calculation in his man's eyes. "The old man isn't worth it. No business is worth this price. Cut your losses." This was the logical, ruthless calculus of their world. Sentiment was a liability. Family, unless it was your own blood, was a pawn. For a moment, the old Walter Moretti, the ghost, considered it. He could sacrifice the old man, eliminate Gallo in a bloody reprisal, and keep Florence locked away, his assets secured. It would be the smart move, the safe move. But then he looked at Florence again. He saw the woman who had defied him, who had run from him, and who had listened to his darkest confession in a ruined building. He remembered the profound, gut-wrenching silence of the house when she was gone. He had built an empire on the principle of never caring, of never exposing a weakness. And now, his greatest weakness stood before him, and the thought of her pain was more unbearable than the thought of losing his entire kingdom. He had built his life on a foundation of power. But what was the point of a kingdom if it meant living in an empty castle? "Tell Gallo I will be there," Walter said, his voice a low, deadly growl. Vincent's eyes widened. "Boss, it's a trap. You go in there alone, you're not coming out." "I will not be alone," Walter said, turning his gaze back to Florence. He made a decision that went against every instinct he had honed over a decade of brutal survival. He would not sacrifice the pawn to save the king. He would burn the entire chessboard to the ground to save her. "Vincent," he ordered, his voice ringing with an authority that left no room for argument, "gather the 10 best men. Arm them with everything we have. We are not going to Pier 12 to negotiate. We are going to war." He walked over to a locked cabinet and opened it, revealing an arsenal of weapons. He took out 2 Colt 1911 pistols, checking their magazines with practiced, efficient movements. He tucked one into a shoulder holster under his tuxedo jacket and handed the other to Vincent. He then turned to Florence. He took her face in his hands, his thumbs gently brushing her cheeks. His slate-gray eyes were ablaze with a terrifying protective fire. "He did this to hurt you," Walter said, his voice a raw whisper, "and in doing so, he has signed his own death warrant. I will bring your father back. I swear it on my life." The promise was an unbreakable vow. This was no longer about territory or business. It was personal. Arthur Gallo had made a fatal mistake. He had threatened the one thing Walter Moretti had just discovered he could not live without. As midnight approached, the convoy of dark, silent cars sped through the deserted streets toward the waterfront. At the head was the Pierce Sarrow carrying Walter. He was no longer a haunted man or a reluctant husband. He was the ghost, the apex predator of New York's underworld, unleashed and singularly focused. He was fighting not for his empire, but for his redemption, and he would pay any price in blood and bullets to claim it. The cannery warehouse on Pier 12 loomed out of the fog-shrouded night like a skeletal behemoth. The air was thick with the reek of salt, rotting fish, and impending violence. Inside, the cavernous space was a maze of shadows and rusting machinery, lit only by a few bare, swinging light bulbs that cast long, dancing shadows. In the center of the warehouse, Marco Rixi was tied to a wooden chair, his face pale with terror, a dirty gag stifling his weak coughs. Arthur Gallo stood nearby, casually smoking a cigarette, the very picture of arrogant confidence. He was flanked by a dozen of his best men, their hands resting on the Thompson's submachine guns, hidden beneath their coats. He had laid the perfect trap. Walter Moretti, the untouchable ghost, would walk in alone to save the girl's father, and he would be cut down in a blaze of glory. It would be the end of an era, and the beginning of his own. The great metal doors of the warehouse groaned open, and a single figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the foggy night. Walter Moretti. He was alone, just as demanded, his hands empty and held slightly away from his body. "Gallo," Walter's voice boomed, echoing in the vast, dead space. "You wanted a meeting. I'm here. Let the old man go." Arthur chuckled, flicking his cigarette away in a shower of sparks. "Always so direct, Walter. No pleasantries. No admiration for my initiative." He gestured around the warehouse. "I must say, I'm disappointed. I thought you were smarter than this. To trade half your empire, your very life, for a sick old man from the slums." "He's not the reason I am here," Walter said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low pitch as he took a slow, deliberate step forward. "Oh." Arthur's curiosity was piqued. "Then why, pray tell, did you walk into my little party?" Walter's eyes, cold and hard as chips of obsidian, found Marco Ricci, then flickered back to Gallo. "You made the mistake of causing pain to what is mine." The raw, possessive claim hung in the air, more powerful than any threat of violence. Arthur's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. This wasn't the cold, calculating businessman he had expected. This was something else, something primal. Touching, Arthur sneered, recovering his composure. "A shame she isn't here to see your grand romantic gesture. Now, about my territory." He never finished the sentence. From the darkest corners of the warehouse, from behind crates and machinery and high up on the catwalks, shadows detached themselves from the darkness. Vincent and 9 other men, clad in black, emerged as one, the metallic click-clack of a dozen machine guns being cocked, echoing like the wrath of God. Arthur Gallo's face went white with shock. His men, caught completely off guard, fumbled for their own weapons, but it was too late. They were surrounded, outmaneuvered, and utterly doomed. "You came alone, Gallo," Walter said, a cold, predatory smile finally touching his lips. "I did not. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. The warehouse erupted in a deafening cacophony of gunfire, the bright flashes of the Thompsons illuminating scenes of brutal, swift violence. Walter drew his own pistol in a blur of motion, his movements economical and deadly. He was not a brawler. He was a surgeon of violence, each shot precise, each movement with purpose. He moved through the chaos directly toward Marco, using the mayhem his men had created as his cover. Arthur, his arrogance shattered, fired wildly in Walter's direction, before turning to flee like the coward he was. But Vincent was there to intercept him, a single brutal blow from his pistol, but sending Gallo to his knees. Within a minute, it was over. The air was thick with the smell of cordite. The only sounds were the groans of the wounded and the drip of water from the leaky ceiling. Walter knelt beside Marco, quickly cutting his bonds and removing the gag. The old man coughed, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe, as he stared at the man who had just dismantled a rival gang to save him. "You're safe now, Marco," Walter said, his voice surprisingly gentle. He helped the frail man to his feet. Vincent dragged a bleeding and defeated Arthur Gallo before him. "Boss, what do you want us to do with him?" Walter looked at the man who had caused him so much grief, the man who had tried to take everything from him. He could kill him. It would be easy. It would be expected. But as he looked at Marco, then thought of Florence waiting for him, he realized that more killing was not the answer. Living was. "He is no longer a threat," Walter said, his voice cold and final. "His power is broken. Put him on a boat to Sicily with nothing but the clothes on his back. If he ever sets foot in New York again, kill him." It was a fate worse than death, exile, and irrelevance. A ghost in his own right. He helped Marco out of the warehouse, into the clean night air, and into the back of the waiting Pier Sarro. The city was beginning to wake, the sky to the east turning a soft, promising shade of gray. When they arrived back at the mansion, Florence was waiting in the grand foyer, a pale, frantic spectre in his silk robe. She had been pacing for hours. The moment she saw her father, alive and unharmed, a choked sob escaped her lips. She ran to him, and they embraced, tears of relief streaming down her face. Walter watched them from a distance, a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest. He had destroyed lives to build his empire. Tonight, he had risked it all to save one, and the feeling of victory was purer than any he had ever known. After Marco was settled in a warm guest room with a doctor attending to him, Florence found Walter in the library. The first light of dawn was filtering through the tall windows, painting the room in soft hues of rose and gold. He was standing by the window, his tuxedo jacket gone, his white shirt stained with a smear of grime and a speck of blood that was not his own. The armor was gone. He looked tired, vulnerable, and more human than she had ever seen him. She walked up to him, her heart too full for words. She reached out and gently touched his arm. He turned to face her, his slate gray eyes searching her face. "He is a part of you," Walter said quietly, "and I will not have any part of you in pain." The simple, profound statement was the most romantic thing he could have possibly said. It was an admission that her happiness was now intrinsically tied to his own. "You saved him," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You risked everything." "My empire is built on sand, Florence," he said, his voice a low, raw murmur. "Power, territory, fear. It all shifts, it all fades. I realized tonight, when I thought I might lose you both, that it meant nothing. A king in an empty castle is just a prisoner." He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before cupping her cheek. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. "The contract is fulfilled. Your father is safe. The debt is paid. You are free to go, Florence. There are no more bars on this cage. I give you my word." He was offering her an out, a real choice. She could walk out the door, take her father, and disappear, resuming a life of poverty, perhaps, but a life that was her own. The thought should have been a relief, a glorious release. But as she looked into his eyes, the eyes of the cruel, haunted Capo, who had bought her, caged her, and then risked his entire world for her, she knew she couldn't leave. The man who had been her captor had impossibly become her sanctuary. The cage had become a home. "And what if I don't want it to go?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. A look of stunned, fragile hope dawned on his face. "Florence." She rose on her toes and silenced him with a kiss. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound, earth-shattering tenderness. It was a kiss of forgiveness, of understanding, and of a new beginning. It was the sealing of a new contract, one not written in debt and fear, but in sacrifice and a shared future. He responded instantly, his arms wrapping round her, pulling her close, as if he were afraid she might vanish. His kiss deepened, speaking of years of loneliness, of a heart that had been locked away and was finally, tentatively, beating again. They stood there in the library as the sun rose over New York, the golden light flooding the room, chasing away the last of the shadows. The ghost of Fifth Avenue had found his soul, and the girl from the slums had found her king. Their story had begun in darkness and coercion, a contract of shadows. But here, in the dawn of a new day, they were choosing to write the next chapter together, not as captor and captive, but as equals, bound by a love forged in the most dangerous of fires. True strength is not found in impenetrable walls, but in the courage to tear them down for the one you love. Redemption is not about erasing the past, but about building a future worthy of forgiveness. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more epic romances that defy the darkness.